We are following breaking news tonight. In a brand new interview with Bloomberg News, President Trump says he views the Mueller probe as, quote, an illegal investigation. And he refuses to say whether he would comply with a subpoena from Robert Mueller's team. President also declining to say whether he will keep his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, in place beyond the November election, simply saying, I just would love to have him do a great job. The interview comes against a rocky legal and political backdrop for Trump world, from the Michael Cohen plea to Paul Manafort's conviction to the prospect of Republicans potentially losing the House a couple of months from now. Trump reacting with another flurry of tweets, more than a dozen of them this time, attacking the Russia investigation, the news media, and the Department of Justice. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports that the Trump White House has, quote, neither the staff nor the strategy to handle the potential consequences of a Democratic takeover of the House, which would likely set off a wave of congressional investigations and even potentially an impeachment inquiry. Quote, Trump has not directed his lawyers or his political aides to prepare an action plan, leaving allies to fret that the president does not appreciate the magnitude of what could be in store next year. One Trump ally telling the Post, winter is coming, but it's like tumbleweeds rolling down the halls there. Nobody's prepared for war. The president also reportedly still trying to find a way to oust his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. Politico reports that Trump is mounting, quote, a furious lobbying campaign against Sessions, which has also worn down his lawyers. Politico also notes that while Trump has been warned that firing Sessions with the Mueller probe still active might open the door to an obstruction charge, quote, Trump's legal team has become increasingly convinced Mueller will make that case regardless of whether the president fires Sessions or leaves him in place. In other words, according to Politico's report, Trump's own lawyers think an obstruction case is imminent. Joining me now is Philip Rucker, White House bureau chief at the Washington Post, Donna Edwards, a former Democratic congresswoman from Maryland, Michael Steele, former chairman of the RNC, and Benjamin Wittes, a senior fellow at Brookings and the editor-in-chief of Lawfare blog. Ben, well, let me just start with you on where we ended there. That reporting from Politico suggests Trump's legal team thinks an obstruction case from the special counsel Robert Mueller is imminent, regardless of anything to do with this Sessions issue. What do you make of that?
Well, so I think the president's legal team, as a criminal matter, I'm sure would argue that the president didn't obstruct justice and would make a defense against that. As a political matter, in the face of a possible impeachment allegation that the president behaved in a way that impeded the due administration of justice, I think the answer is duh. Right? I mean, they're just facing a certain reality there that when Mueller decides to drop and line up all the facts that he has amassed, that is going to be a devastating day for the president.
And I'm just, take us through quickly. This is a mechanical question, but I think it's an important one. The only modern precedent since Watergate here was Clinton in '98 with impeachment. And what you had there was the independent counsel, slightly different than the special counsel, reported back to Congress. Congress then said, OK, here's the report. We're going to release it. We're going to vote to release it publicly. The arrangement's different now. So Mueller reports to the DOJ is correct. Do the American people get access to whatever he finds in full detail?
So we don't know. We don't know what form his report, if in fact he is writing a report, which is the assumption that the president's lawyers have been talking about, but is not something we know from Mueller himself or his team. If, in fact, he's working on an obstruction report, we don't know what form that will take. We also don't know, will he do what Leon Jaworski did during Watergate, which is a referral to Congress, or will he just write the final report of the type contemplated in the regulation that you're describing, which, as you say, would go to the Deputy Attorney General? So I don't think we know whether it's going to be what form it'll take, or under what circumstances the public will get to see it.
And Philip Rucker, your reporting was so interesting because it's Trump's folks looking ahead to the potential after November of Democrats getting control of Congress. You get that power. That means you have the power of oversight. It also means, hey, majority rules in the House. If a majority, if all Democrats then say they want to impeach, they can impeach. We saw Republicans to do that to Clinton. Is this a White House now that's thinking in those terms, in terms of impeachment?
They're not prepared for that at all. There's a lot of fear within Trump's orbit, and including people at the White House and on the legal team, that Trump is simply not appreciating the magnitude of what could be in store for him. If and when Democrats take over the House of Representatives, it'll be a series of investigations, of subpoenas, of hearings, of document requests, and it could include impeachment proceedings. And he doesn't have a personal legal team ready to deal with an impeachment proceeding, but he also doesn't have the infrastructure inside the White House, at the counsel's office and in the communications staff, to deal with the sort of hour by hour, day by day demands from Congress.
Yeah, I mean, Donna Edwards, I'm curious, just take us inside the thinking of Democrats out there, potentially if they get control of the House. I know Democratic leaders have been very hesitant to talk about impeachment, but you've got, Trump's own lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, out there. He says, hey, impeachment's the thing I'm guarding against here. It's the main thing that he says he still sees out there. What is the appetite for Democrats if they get control to move forward with something along those lines?
Well, I think part of the reason that Giuliani and the president's team are talking about impeachment is because they believe that that is something to generate more excitement among their base about the upcoming elections. But I think for Democrats have been really careful about waiting to say, let's get a report first before we decide how it is that we're going to move forward. Clearly, the Democratic base is ready to move tomorrow or yesterday. But I think the leadership, very rightly, is waiting to get a report because they know that that is the kind of report that is going to be out for broader public consumption so that they have a basis to move forward. And I think that it's going to be really important that whether it's required or not, that report at some level is going to have to be made public because we can't just have the continued speculation through the rest of the president's term.
Well, while the president has wanted to fire Jeff Sessions since he recused himself from the Russia probe way back, Politico notes that he's also been, quote, griping to aides and lawmakers that the attorney general doesn't have the Ivy League pedigree the president prefers, that he can't stand his southern accent, that Sessions isn't a capable defender of the president on television, in part because he talks like he has marbles in his mouth, the president has told aide. So a scathing review by the president there, according to Politico. But Michael Steele, on that issue of Jeff Sessions and his status, it sounds like in this interview tonight with Bloomberg, the president's talking about, okay, Sessions stays through the midterm elections. Sounds like that, from what I can understand, Republican senators like Lindsey Graham have been telling him, that's what we need from you. Wait till the midterms. But after that, does it sound like Sessions out, or are there going to be Republicans there, his old friends in the Senate, who say even then Trump's being rash in doing that?
Well, Steve, you raised an interesting point. From the folks that I've talked to, the background story on this is they finally got the president to agree to the space that they're all in, and that is do nothing before election and get everything done between the election and the new sitting of Congress in January, whether Republicans have control of that Congress, the House specifically, or not. And that is, they'll use that interregnum, if you will, to do the types of things that Donald Trump wants to do, like fire Sessions. They think the political ramifications from that won't be as powerful because of the excitement around the election, if there's a changeover in the House and a lot of other things that are going on. So it becomes a distraction within a distraction, and they've telegraphed that beforehand, so there's no need for people to get all worked up and excited about it. And that was the hardest thing, was to get the president to that point where he wouldn't pull the trigger this week or last week like he wanted to, but wait instead until after the election.
And Michael, I'm also curious about this. In terms of the election, the message from Democrats, and you're seeing it in terms of what Philip Hassan is reporting there, Republicans and folks around Trump anticipating Democrats really aggressively using that oversight power if they get control of the House. That's one of the messages from Democrats to voters, I think, which is, hey, let's have a check on this president. Let's have some folks there to make sure, all the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, or beyond that potentially. But what is the Republican counter to that? That, it seems there's a history of the American people liking oversight in these midterm elections.
That's a very difficult argument to make, or counter argument rather, to make, according to Phil's reporting, largely because Republicans sat around and did nothing. If they'd actually showed a modicum of interest in any form of investigation, then they could have had a narrative established to counteract that comment or that argument from Democrats. But instead, you had Devin Nunes, who is projected as someone out there who's colluding, to use that term, with the White House to obstruct, to use another term, House investigations from thoroughly investigating what's going on. The Senate, as anyone in this town knows, was the more adult of the two chambers in sort of going forward with that. But the damage had been done in the House, and the damage had been done specifically by certain members in the House who did not take seriously, at least in terms of how the public looked at it, Steve, the investigative opportunity to set the course a little bit differently from where we have it now.
Well, in those tweets we were talking about earlier, among them, the president today denying several recent reports, including indicating that the White House counsel Don McGahn may play a key role in any potential obstruction case. Quote, I like Don, but he was not responsible for me not firing Bob Mueller or Jeff Sessions. So much fake reporting and fake news. In another of Trump's denials, the president appeared to say that he decided that McGahn would go, suggesting the White House counsel did not resign but was fired. Quote, the rigged Russia witch hunt did not come into play even a little bit with respect to my decision on Don McGahn. However, the White House today told NBC News that the president was referring to the decision to accept McGahn's resignation, not a decision to fire him. Ben, these word games here about what exactly transpired with McGahn, whether this is a resignation, a forced resignation, an accepted resignation, a firing. Is there any significance there in terms of Mueller watching this play out? Is there any significance to him what the exact sequence of events was there?
So I'm not sure. I mean, I do think McGahn may be the first person to have a resignation accepted by the president that he learned he had given when the president tweeted about it. You know, like whether the president fired McGahn or whether McGahn was planning to leave and the president just kind of, you know, gave him a shove on Twitter, it's really hard to know. I will say this, when the president tweets that McGahn had nothing to do with did not stop him from firing Sessions or Mueller, there is one person who knows whether that's true or not, or whether it's, as the president says, fake news and fake reporting, and that's Bob Mueller, because he's spent 30 hours with Don McGahn. And, you know, so the president, if he's not telling the truth about that, there's one very important person that he will not be fooling. And, you know, he can kind of get himself through news cycles by making up facts that are convenient for him at the moment. But that's a very short-term strategy when you're dealing with a highly professional.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.